It's really nice to go through life with, well, colored glasses on, where you don't quite see reality. And while Iranian politicians are chanting death to America, President Obama is promising to give Iran more nuclear technology to seal the deal. And the June 30th deadline is looming large.
Yes, it is. Lifting sanctions could also result in billions of dollars for Iran, billions that it could funnel back into terrorism. Gary Lane has more.
Despite a broken leg, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is racing, or perhaps hobbling, to Vienna, hoping to save the nuclear talks from collapse. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, announced Wednesday that before any agreement is signed, economic, financial, and banking sanctions imposed against Iran must be lifted.
Lifting of sanctions cannot depend on the implementation of Iran's obligations. No, we absolutely do not accept that.
The framework agreement reached last April allows Iran to continue its nuclear program, but would limit the number of centrifuges that could be maintained over a 10-year period. Sanctions would be phased out as international nuclear inspectors verify Iranian compliance. But on Wednesday, Iran announced no foreigners would be allowed on Iranian military facilities, where much of its nuclear activity is hidden. And the Associated Press says it has obtained a confidential document disclosing that American negotiators have offered Iran high-tech reactors and other advanced nuclear equipment in exchange for reductions in its nuclear development program. In April, President Obama insisted his proposed nuclear agreement with Iran would be effective.
It is a good deal, a deal that meets our core objectives. This framework would cut off every pathway that Iran could take to develop a nuclear weapon.
Many Obama administration critics say the deal would actually allow Iran to eventually develop nuclear weapons. Among them is the Clarion Project's Ryan Morrow, who told CBN News he's concerned about Iranian-sponsored terrorism.
One of the questions we have is that when Iran gets billions and billions of dollars as a result of this nuclear deal, it will not only be funneled back into their nuclear program, but back into the terrorist apparatus that is helping to kill our soldiers in Afghanistan and will likely kill our soldiers in Iraq as well.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the deal is getting worse by the day.
And it should not be signed. It has been said, better no deal than a bad deal. Better no deal than a terrible deal. And that's what the choice is today.
With only 5 days left before the final agreement deadline, it looks like John Kerry and other Western negotiators will offer more concessions and then take what they can get. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Thanks, Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, don't you wonder, have you heard about IED, the ones that blew up our troops and our tanks and our Humvees over in Iraq and Afghanistan? Who made them? Iran. Who has been the chief sponsor of terror around the world? Iran. Who supports Hamas? Who supports Hezbollah in Lebanon? Iran. Who has been responsible for some of the chaos in Syria? Iran. Who do we think we're dealing with? These are the people who have, these are the people who have imprisoned Christians, who have beheaded people, who have hanged people, who have brought on a reign of terror in their own nation. Who do we think we're dealing with? What is wrong with Obama? What does he think this is going to do? Now he's going to give them advanced nuclear material so they can build their own stuff? We had them on the ropes. The sanctions were biting. Iran had to make a deal. We had all the cards. We had complete control of the situation. And we are surrendering every single advantage we have and are getting nothing in response. It's just amazing. He says, this deal meets all of our standards. It meets no such thing. I can't understand it. What is he trying to do? But there's one thing I want everybody to realize. They believe, the Iranian leadership believes in the existence of the Mahdi. the mythological Muslim figure who's going to come onto the scene, the 12th Imam. And when he does, it will be at the end of a chaotic war in which there will be just total chaos on the earth, and the Mahdi will come to put everything right. That's what they believe, and they think the Mahdi is going to appear in the city of Qum in Iran. That's their core belief. And in the process, they also believe in the supremacy of Islam over all other faiths. Now, that's what we're dealing with. And we're going to talk about a deal. They'll lie about every single phrase in it. Well, there's another liar, but this man has done terrible damage to human beings in the Boston Marathon. He's the one that stuck the middle finger up at some newscaster some years ago. Now he says, I'm going to apologize. I'm sorry. Ephraim Graham has more on that story. Here's Ephraim.
Pat, the Boston Marathon bomber apologized to his victims in court Wednesday before receiving his formal sentencing. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev heard 3 hours of testimony from the victims and their families. Then he broke his 2-year silence, offering an apology. But Tsarnaev did not renounce terrorism, leading some survivors to say his comments were empty and insincere.
I regret having ever wanted to hear him speak, because what he said showed no remorse, no regret, and no empathy for what he's done to our lives.
A judge formerly sentenced Tsarnaev to death. His attorney says they will appeal that sentence. More than 30 Americans are being held hostage abroad, and President Obama says their families can now pay ransoms to their captors without fear of federal prosecution. The move comes after some families faced with trying to secure loved ones from groups like ISIS complained about possible prosecution and confusing information from the government. The president apologized to families who were treated like afterthoughts in their darkest hours.
I'm making it clear that these families are to be treated like what they are, our trusted partners and active partners in the recovery of their loved ones. We are all on the same team, and nobody cares more about bringing home these Americans than their own families.
U.S. policy still prohibits the government from paying ransoms or making concessions to terrorists, but Pat, critics fear allowing families to pay ransoms puts Americans at greater risk of being kidnapped when abroad.
It will be a shakedown racket of massive proportions. The problem is the CIA didn't talk to the FBI didn't talk to NASA, NASA doesn't talk to the other agencies, State Department doesn't talk to any of them, and consequently these families of hostages get shuffled back and forth, and they're very frustrated. But does anybody think that by paying a couple $100,000 they're going to get their loved ones freed? Not unless the United States is clearly on board. And what this signals is that the U.S. really isn't going to be on board. They're going to wash their hands of the whole deal. So it sort of makes you sad to see what's going to happen. But it is happening. I was reminded of a president we had who's talked about speak softly and carry a big stick. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, one of the Rough Riders. And over in Algeria, there was a Greek. The Greek was a part American citizen. He wasn't a full citizen. He was part American. And he was captured by a bandit named Rassouli. Now, did we pay ransom to Rassouli? No way. Teddy Roosevelt stormed out of the Oval Office and he said to the reporters, he said, Petticaris alive or Rassouli dead. And it was just that way. And if he doesn't give us back Rassouli and, Petticaris alive, I'm going to go in there and kill Rassouli. And that's exactly what he intended to do. And Rassouli got the message and Petticaris came out. That was one American. That's the way this nation took care of its hostages. We didn't let anybody beat our people up overseas. Now, we've got thousands of them, at least hundreds of them, who are in terrible conditions, and we just, smile and nod. And in the case of Saeed Ahmadiji, Abedini, we still make a deal with the people who hold him without insisting that he get come free. Ephraim?
Pat, anyone on the internet can now find stolen login information to access government computers. A CIA-backed tech company has found logins and passwords for 47 government agencies all over the web, available for hackers, spies, and thieves. A report by the company Recorded Future says at least 12 agencies don't require authentication beyond passwords to access their networks, making them vulnerable to espionage and cyber attacks. America is facing severe threats at home and abroad. That's the message from one retiring Republican senator. 72-year-old Dan Coats of Indiana says he only came back to the Senate to serve his country for one term because he saw dangers escalating in America. He recently spoke with our Heather Sells about what's at stake.
In the United States.
After an 11-year absence, Dan Coats returned to the Senate in 2011, motivated, he says, by two major threats. The first he calls the debt bomb.
Just from a practical standpoint, you can't just keep borrowing money. It's going to go off someday, and it's going to have a devastating impact on our country's economy and on our kids' future.
That's topped only by what Coats describes as the terror bomb. The worst nightmare, he says, terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. That could translate into the greatest loss of life ever on U.S. soil.
We'd be talking about numbers in the 3 million range, not the 3,000 range.
A major disappointment for Coats this year, the so-called U.S. Freedom Act. Lawmakers recently approved it to replace the Patriot Act.
Because it was so misrepresented, quote, they're listening to all your calls, government's in your bedroom, it's in your house, it's on your phone, which is not the case. Politically, the decision was made to compromise that down, and I think that makes us more vulnerable.
Another threat has surfaced since Coats returned to office, the hostility facing Christians who are open about their faith. The Wheaton College graduate says faith in God is the foundation of his life. Coats was stunned this spring by the attack on religious freedom in his home state of Indiana.
It was almost like an assault on people who were attempting and trying to do the right thing, and that is recognize the constitutional rights of freedom of religion and not to have those abused or taken away or discounted. So I was in shock over the fact that the assault was so direct and so strong and so intolerant, frankly.
Indiana lawmakers are expected to take up the issue again next year, and Coats hopes that they respect religious beliefs and behave in what he calls a responsible way. In the meantime, he will spend his last 18 months as senator fighting for freedom at the national level at a time when he says the threat level has never been higher. Heather Sells, CBN News.
A group of Christian institutions could appeal to the Supreme Court over the contraception mandate in Obamacare. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled against them Monday, saying the mandate is not a substantial burden because it allows faith-based groups to opt out of directly providing birth control for employees. But religious charities and Christian universities say the law violates their religious rights because they're still being forced to authorize someone else to provide the contraceptives, which may include abortion-inducing drugs. Major League Baseball great and former New York Yankee Mariano Rivera and his family are traveling to visit Israel. Rivera joined Israel's tourism minister, Yariv Levin, for a first-hand look at Jerusalem's Tower of David Museum in the heart of the Old City. The Tower of David houses a section of Herod's palace built 2,000 years ago. Part of the museum is also likely the site of the trial of Jesus. The future Hall of Famer, who saved more games than anyone else in Major League history, is also a strong Christian and told CBN News what it means for him to be in the Holy Land.
Well, I mean, the reason why I'm here is just I wanted to know, read so much in the Bible, and I wanted to know the history of Israel. Amazing. You know, I mean, reading about, again, reading in the Bible and walking and seeing and being able to touch it, can't describe it. I have no words for that.
Rivera will be attending Israel's Baseball Association Summer Tournament. The association hopes to build state-of-the-art baseball and softball fields throughout Israel. Future Hall of Famer indeed. Pat?
Well, maybe baseball will save the world. Some people think football will.